Our guest today is Dr. Charles Harry, former NSA executive, award-winning cyber risk pioneer, and now professor and research director at the University of Maryland. He's one of the few people truly bridging strategy, technology, and national security. Buckle up. This really is legitimate cybersecurity. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Legitimate Cybersecurity. Today we have a great guest who I really love, Dr. Charles Harry, affectionately known as Charlie to us. I've worked with Charlie for when we first met in like 2007, 2008.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think 2007.
Yeah, it's been a long time, and it's been a really great time as well. One of the things that's been fantastic about working with Charlie is he has taken a lot of different perspectives that are not considered part of cybersecurity traditionally. And what I say is, like, Charlie's effectively married economics, which is not just finance. I've learned in part thanks to Charlie. It is the measurement of change, correct? At its heart is the measurement of change, not just financial, but people talk about financial change so much.
Resource allocation, efficient resource allocation.
There we go.
Yep.
Where it takes resource allocation, and he's applied it effectively to cybersecurity in a lot of creative ways. So knowing each other for a long time, we first met at the Department of Defense, and now we still work together off and on doing different things in academia. So thank you for coming, Charlie. I will also note, I'm pretty sure he's one of the smartest guys I've ever met. Not just with cyber, but this guy had it figured out when I first met him. We were in the basement at DOD when he was like, no, what you need to do is you got to start investing in these key plays. And, how about you got to invest in Netflix and this and that? And I'm like, Charles, I got $5. I'm going to invest it in a burrito at 7-Eleven. Yep. But if you ever, this is not financial advice or anything, but
that's called a negative return, by the way. Like when you invest $5 in a burrito.
It kept me alive.
You're the doctor. Yeah. That's why you're the doctor.
Anyway, thank you so much, Charlie, for coming. One of the things I wanted to discuss with you is before we started recording and so forth, you had discussed something that Dustin and I think of a lot, which is what you're calling the art of cybersecurity here. And that's the communication element between a lot of different parts of people who are in the field of cybersecurity. Can you tell us more about what that is and why it's such a big struggle right now in the field?
Well, so more generally, I'm going to start off with kind of like the broader abstract and then kind of drill in a couple of key areas. So what I focus a lot on is what I affectionately like to call strategic cybersecurity, which encompasses a couple of kind of key areas. We all, are very much aware of like all the kind of technical aspects of cyber. It's kind of a well-developed part of the field. So, there's not, I wouldn't say there's an awful lot to learn about what we need to know. Maybe some, certainly things change at the very tactical level. That changes constantly. But an area of the field that is not well explored is the idea of kind of a strategic view of cyber, both from a defensive standpoint as well as an offensive standpoint. And I want to talk a little bit about both of those. So from a defensive standpoint, I spend an awful lot of time thinking about the idea of risk. Risk not just to technical systems, risk not just even to organizations, but risk to like entire sectors, right? And so, and a lot of us, that are in this field, we talk about risk. You're working with your CISO or you're a CISO, and you're trying to constantly think about how do I justify resource spend, all that type of stuff. So I do a lot of work at modeling that type of risk, but I also think an awful lot about, well, what if I'm a governor, or what if I'm the president of the United States, and I want to understand risk to, an entire sector like county governments, or hospitals, or transportation networks. The problem, as we all know, is that, those are, when you talk about a sector like the health sector, talking about tens of thousands of organizations, millions of networks, right, that are all individually owned. And so you, as even president of the United States, had zero understanding of what the technical health is across the entire country, right? And so, when you look at a lot of the policy documents that are out there, they say all great and wonderful things, right? We're going to take a risk-based approach to, kind of understanding risk. But like, how do you actually do it, right? Like, how do you actually measure this? So a lot of the work I do at the university is really starting at kind of the theory level, but then moving to practical research where, we've actually over the last 7 years had developed some of those capabilities. We just pushed out a paper in January where for the first time we analyzed basically what we've come to call the integrated attack surface of an entire sector. We did county governments, and we looked at basically enumerated over 50,000 devices that were on the internet, looking at exposed services, looking at potential vulnerabilities, looking at exposed passwords as a way to get a holistic view. So that's kind of one area that we look at. And then another area that I spent a lot of time on the offensive side is working with the military. We're writing a book right now, my co-author and I, looking at cyber operational art. The idea that how do you go from, okay, here's the strategic intent of cyber-based operations, and then here are the kind of the technical pieces. I'm in the weeds and I'm following my, kind of my kill chain logic or my MITRE attacks, attack logic. But the problem is there's this middle ground that is often not filled. So how do I translate kind of my strategic intent to the tactical actions that are needed to achieve them, right? And that's what we affectionately call operational art. And so a lot of the work that we're doing now is really trying to better articulate that, because what we find and kind of the core thesis of the work we're doing is that technology, when it's brought to bear for military purposes, isn't always immediately of great utility. A good example would be aircraft, right? We had aircraft in the early 20th century, but it wasn't until World War II that they really became effective, right? And it wasn't just because of the technology. A lot of it was what we call operational art, the idea of how do you employ kind of air power. And yet you see the same thing with tanks, see the same thing with subs, you see the same thing with drones. They evolve over time. And so there's a big debate, at least in academia, about the effectiveness of cyber-based operations. And this is a way for us to try to close that gap.
Wow. Awesome. Yeah. So is that, I guess that gap that you're speaking to, Charlie, is it kind of like, just to put it into the terms that I think I'm hearing, is it that there is a technology, it's being currently utilized, we think it can be utilized for something tactically within military operations, but the gap is like how do we operationalize this? Like how do we, that's the gap, that's the art.
Yeah, so think about it. We've got a multi-billion-dollar group, U.S. Cyber Command, that has invested a lot of money. I would argue in a lot of the kind of the tactical and technical aspects of cyber, but there's this kind of middle ground of figuring out like, well, how am I going to employ those systems, right? Maybe a good analogy is aircraft, right? So you got a bunch of aircraft, but you got to figure out like, how do I want to leverage them, right? How many do I need?
Yeah.
I've got this one beautiful Joint Strike Fighter, and it's technologically advanced, but I have no sense of the number that I need. I have no sense of like where they should be employed, like in terms of centers of gravity. All of those are concepts that have evolved over, let's say, the last 50 to 70 years, right? And and people have lost sight of that. And so when they think of, hey, you've got some opponents of cyber who say, well, cyber is a niche capability. It's good for things like espionage. It's good for maybe subtle sabotage. But it's not very good as a new domain of warfighting. So you get this debate between some people who are like, well, we're not going to fight with traditional weapons anymore. It's only going to be cyber. Versus other folks that say, oh, that's a bunch of, hooey. That's just, it's not useful whatsoever. And the argument we're making is like, well, both sides have a point here. But the reality is that in order to be more effective, what we're actually missing is the art form of how it's actually employed. Less about the technology, more about operational concepts and specific art of how it's employed. And then we're developing a theory that allows people to build those frameworks and actually do more effective campaign planning for both offense and defense.
Okay, so do you think that, in your opinion, from what you've seen so far, do you think that most cyber operations really haven't been following any kind of framework or kind of conceptualized, true, here's our objective, here's how we're going to do it? Has it all been fly by night? And I'm asking for a friend.
Yeah, no, I honestly, the way that
yeah.
the way I would characterize most cyber operations is they're ad hoc. It's
Okay.
Really?
yeah. So
Yeah.
by ad hoc, what I mean is, and maybe there's some folks listening who are like, are getting very upset and throwing things, after me saying that. I don't mean ad hoc in the sense that there's no planning. Of course, there's
Sure.
planning.
Yeah.
What I mean is, let me give you maybe an analogy from another military domain, aircraft. When you look at the way that aircraft were employed during World War I, we had aircraft, right? And yet they were not a significant part of the military campaigns in Western Europe, right? The way that we leveraged aircraft in World War I is we would send them out for reconnaissance purposes. We would, they didn't have enough capability to drop munitions. So what they would do is they would fly over and drop a hand grenade. So it was, maybe the equivalent of like subtle sabotage.
Yeah.
And it was, yeah. And so it wasn't until much later when the numbers, as well as some of the technical aspects of aircraft, better, engines, more lift capacity, that you actually started seeing fleets of bombers doing strategic bombing runs, right, against cities.
Right.
And so what I would argue is missing in cyber today is an understanding of how technical attacks, like, you're in a network, you want to disrupt a particular system, how does that translate to a strategic effect, right? And it requires a new way of thinking. It requires an understanding of what we would call a systems of systems approach or socio-technical analysis. So if I'm trying to affect I don't know, the movement of troops from one point of the earth to the next, typically the way this is done is people say, well, this train company operates, those train tracks. And they think, well, that's what I'm going to go target. And the commander might say, well, we're going to target that organization. Well, it's actually not the organization you care about because 99% of the systems in that network are irrelevant to your operational purpose. What you care about are very specific systems that are part of a human process that once disrupted, create cascading failures that generate the strategic effect you're seeking, right? And so that requires you to better understand the human map, the human process map, and how technology supports it. And what you might find is that it's not just one network that you care about. They've got suppliers, they've got third-party vendors, right? And we see this happen all the time. We just don't recognize it, right? So when you see some of these cascading failures, things like, it's a non-cyber example, but CrowdStrike, the CrowdStrike, botched software rollout created how much disruption, right? It's because they were a key vendor that were operating on key systems. So when Delta was grounded, had nothing to do with Delta's systems other than the CrowdStrike box that they were running, right? And it created all sorts of problems. The little agents that they had running on all their various systems. That's an example of a cascading failure, right? So there's lots of ways to skin the cat when it comes to generating strategic effects. And that's, I argue, is a terrain map that we are not doing effectively either for offense or defense.
All right. So Charlie, another thing that we wanted to discuss is you've done a lot of research on the vulnerability of state and local government organizations. Primarily, you did a really impressive study that identified the vulnerability of, over 400 school districts, if I remember. And there was a lot of interesting findings there. Can you dive deeper into that and tell us, you're talking about the coordination part. So as this coordination part is growing, this middle ground, this art area, especially with communication, how you're seeing that on impact different levels of government, but specifically I'm interested in, because you hear so much about it right now, how schools, right, are these ripe targets, which they kind of are, but can you explain how that can be enhanced and what the findings were that you discovered as well?
Yeah, so this was, this study and research that we have at the University of Maryland. I'm the director of something called GoTech, or the Center for Governance and Technology and Systems. You can check out our research on the web. But what we're trying to get at, again, is this idea of strategic cybersecurity. And I was specifically hit with some problems that I had some conversations with folks in federal government as well as state government, where they were really lamenting the inaccessibility of actual data that would inform how problematic things are. So everyone kind of, does what we call a lot of hand waving, saying, okay, well, we know cyber's a problem. It's like, thanks, got it. But how big of a problem, and more specifically, and this is where kind of economics comes into play, is if I have a finite amount of defensive resources, and every CISO knows this, right? Like, where do I put those resources to reduce my overall risk? It's no different if you're operating at the federal level. If you're the National Cyber Director and you're advocating for increased budget for, on behalf of CISA or with CISA, so that they can potentially have a pot of money to work with state and local governments to address the problem of cybersecurity, there's this kind of basic question, like, where should we spend it, right? And how do we make that determination? Do we just do it by population? So if you are the more populated states get more money. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Another way to do it, and I would argue is probably more ideal, is to identify where the problems are. Like, where are the problems? And it might be that California doesn't have a lot of issues. And it turns out that maybe Tennessee's got real problems because they're just underfunded, right? And so maybe that makes a lot more sense to spend more money in Tennessee per capita than it would be in California. And so the question, this was kind of the motivation for the study. And so what we developed was basically a new spin on an old idea. We took this idea of attack surface mapping. Every cyber person knows this is kind of cyber 101. Everyone knows how to enumerate their attack surface.
Maybe 102, because I teach 101 at night. So
okay, there we go. 102, right.
Sometimes they're not ready for risk yet.
Right. So one of the things, kind of struck me was, how do you not only kind of get this big snapshot of an entire sector when you don't control the information? Like, I don't have access to all their internal information. So how do I do it from the outside? How am I able to do this at scale? And how am I able to do it repeatably over time, right? Because things change over time. And it's a real problem. And folks in the federal government were not doing this. They're not doing this now. Even at the state level, they don't do it. And so what we did is we, took a project with some of our grad students and undergrad students, and we developed some Python scripts that basically utilize open source repositories of port scans from Census, Shodan, some other sources. And what we did is we cobbled together the domains of all the county governments across the United States. And we've also done this now with school districts as well, because those are knowable. And the first thing that we do is we obviously enumerate kind of the web servers. Okay, that's great. That's one aspect of the attack surface. But we utilize the Census service because they're able to pull the TLS certs, and they're able to correlate, other devices that are on the attack surfaces. So we get like VPNs, we get email servers, we get a lot of other things. And we pull all the exposed services. We pull like open ports. We pull the CPE strings that are on there. And then we're able to crosswalk the CPE strings with known vulnerabilities. And we're able to then score by CVSS, EPSS. And so what that gives us is, it's not a perfect view, but it at least gives us and we do this by domain. And because the domains are now tied to county governments, right? And states, we actually can visualize an entire map. And this is what, we basically been able to publish. Now, we took great pains not to create a target map for people to go after. But what it gives us is a no-kidding understanding for the very first time, at least in academic circles, but I'm not aware of anyone doing it even in the private sector, is an entire view of the United States for one whole sector, county governments, and be able to say, like, here's the average number of devices, basic questions like, how many devices on average do county governments expose to the internet? How many like unique services are they exposed to? Is it mostly HTTP, HTTPS, or do we see Telnet? Do we see RDP? Do we see MS SQL? Guess what? We see all of those things, right?
Oh no!
I mean, it's crazy. Some of that. I mean, Telnet. I mean, seriously, holy mackerel. So we see that, right? And that gives us a sense of we can start to score the potential likelihood of attacks, right? If I see exposed DNS directly, like, okay, you might open yourself up to a DDoS, right? If I see Telnet, they may be able to brute force their way right into your network. And so that gives us a way to think about risk.
Yeah. So your results are horrifying.
Yes.
Why do you think it is then, with these really concerning findings, that there still doesn't seem to be much of a push to implement and invest in local cyber resilience, like on the local level? So, where's the gap there? What's going on? Is this kind of like the art aspect you were talking about, or is this bigger?
Yeah, so this is an immature part of the field. And one of the reasons why I spend so much time thinking about this, you're starting to see a little bit of movement, certainly in academia. I'm part of a couple of working groups where we've presented our findings and people are starting to see, oh my gosh, there's this kind of bigger picture that we're missing. And because everyone's so hyper focused on the point solutions, right? Like, and understandably so, I'm not dismissing that. That's really important. But there's this other aspect that we're kind of missing, and that's where we're trying to garner a little bit more light. The federal government is actually devoted in the previous administration, although it seems to be maybe being scaled back a bit in this current administration. It remains to be seen what's going to happen with it. But they put down quite a bit of money for state and local grants to basically help state and locals address the problem of cybersecurity. But when you take a look at the way that things were allocated, they really, I mean, effectively did it by population. And part of the reason is they may quibble with me a little bit on that, but that's what it kind of looks like. But generally speaking, what has occurred is that these monies have kind of just been given to states in pots. So like Maryland, for instance, I forget the size of theirs. It was a little over 100 million, I think. And then the idea is that the counties can then apply to the state with some project, right? To say like, oh, well, we need to do X, Y, and Z. Give us $1 million, $2 million to spend on it. The problem is there's no standardization. So what is it that you're actually trying to accomplish? Are you trying to reduce the severity of the attack surface? That would maybe be one objective. But the way that the money is being spent, it's like a kind of haphazard. It's like, well, one county wants to do better training. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But is that, like, from a strategic point of view, is that the best way to spend the money? Or should we do the basic things first? I would argue do the basic things first.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. And then move
up
the ladder.
Asset management in gear, right? Like
right. It's like, like step one, like what's your inventory, right? Like of the devices that you have, right? Like before you do anything fancy, you got to do the basics.
Which, by the way, we know this guy, Charlie Harry, who has this data set that already has some of your assets that are out there. So
well, the crazy
it's probably public, so you can probably ask him for it. But anyway.
Well, this is, we're very, very careful about how we do it because we take a snapshot every month. So I've been capturing this data for a year.
Yeah.
And so now what we're able to look at is the dynamic changes in the attack surface. So the paper we're working on right now is focused around the variability, and IP addresses. Are they being, is it relatively stable or is it really dynamic? And the thing is, we postulate these things. We say, oh, things change constantly. Well, do they? Yeah. I mean, like, I'm not sure.
If you still got Telnet out there, I don't know. Maybe they don't change as constantly as we think they do.
That's right.
No, they don't.
And in fact, what we're seeing is some of our initial results is that it may be a little bit more static than people think. In some ways, it's more variable, but a lot of the variation is actually tied to very specific counties. And what we're finding is that, like, at least on the IP side, that a lot of the IP variability is because people have signed up to, services like Cloudflare, where they're spinning things up and down constantly. So that makes sense. And I wouldn't say that is a dynamic attack surface in the traditional sense.
Right.
Right.
Your CDN does not make it's security through obscurity is not a thing, right?
Right. The other thing that it gives us the opportunity to test, because I love to test like the conventional wisdom, is when you look at national policy for trying to improve things like cybersecurity, we're all, probably aware of like the KEV list, right? So, CISA comes out, they generate this KEV list. And the idea is, the policy idea is that if I tell everyone these are the worst of the worst exploits and you need to patch them right away, then theoretically what we should see is when a new KEV is added to the list, that CVE gets patched, right, in a relatively short period of time. If the policy...
In theory. In a perfect world, Charles.
Exactly.
But I think you and I have seen what actually happens.
That's right. And so that's what we're starting to test now. Again, like some very, very early results, that doesn't seem to be the case. And so we're not quite, I don't want to say it's a definitive conclusion yet, but that's what it appears to be. Occasionally you'll see KEVs get patched pretty quickly, but that's usually because there's an ongoing exploit campaign. And it usually is months after the KEV has actually been listed. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that the federal government's policy intervention is maybe not working as designed.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Dustin.
So that's been a continuing theme, I think, throughout cybersecurity, in which even in a regulation or even in any kind of guidance, it's so non-prescriptive. And I get why, right? You kind of already tackled why. It's you can go to people in the same sector doing the exact same thing and their infrastructure is going to be completely different. Right. So you can't just say, hey, use this, this, and this, because that's not necessarily going to work. Is there how are we tackling that? Like how can we be more prescriptive in things like legislation, in things like regulations, in things like grant acceptance and proposals and grants? How can we make sure that we are saying, hey, by the way, make sure you're doing these like 5 fundamental things. You're spending it on one of these 5, or maybe we're already doing that with the grant proposal stuff, but it doesn't sound like we are. It sounds like it's like, if you promise to spend this on cybersecurity, we'll give you $100 million. And that can mean anything. Cybersecurity could mean more physical security. Cybersecurity could mean you bought CrowdStrike for 10 years or whatever it is, depending on how many endpoints you have. So how do we get more prescriptive with it without, while being vendor neutral and possibly, cyber, what's the word I'm looking for? Like,
agnostic?
Yeah. Yeah. Like vendor agnostic.
Yeah, I like vendor neutral. Vendor neutral works. We can, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, you certainly don't want to go down the road of like, thou shall have this specific system, thou shall, architecture, your network in this particular way. That just won't work. And the engineers are like, please do not do that. Like, that would make our life hell. But you also can't be so hands off where you just say something like, as long as you follow like NIST CSF, you're good. I mean, that's a good roadmap, of course. Big fan of that. But you also, I think it's important to, pick those 5 things or those 10 things, CIS or the Center for Internet Security. They have like I think it's like their top 8, and if you do those like 8 things, it's like 85% of all.
Yeah, where they have the implementation groups of 1, 2, 3, but they don't like to call it maturity because they're very insistent. It's not maturity, that it is just an improving implementation group.
Right. I think those are areas where I think it can be a little bit more useful. I think the Biden administration started to go down this road with some of their regulatory approaches for cyber. So they started, as you guys are probably well aware, they started actually being much more prescriptive in things like rail security and pipelines and hospitals and ports. There's pros and cons to that. I mean, I think in some cases, when you look at what they were, having them do, it was still a little generic in some ways. Like, okay, as long as you have to have a system security plan, right? Okay. That may not necessarily, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think when it comes to money, though, like when it comes very specifically to, hey, we're going to give you grant funds for you to go do things. I think having a little bit more thought about, well, what is it, even though we're giving that state $100 million, which sounds like a lot of money, it's actually not, because when you think about both the number of counties that you and then the localities, I mean, it's not just county governments, it's municipalities as well. Then you also have to think about, how can they maintain those services indefinitely, right? Because that money is like a one-time grant.
Yeah, everything's a subscription now. So yeah.
That's right. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more thought about, well, maybe this money should go towards things that are actually pretty reasonable for them to maintain on their own. That would be helpful. Like, so active management of your attack surface, I think, is one of them, right? Like, that's something that should not cost you a lot of money, to be able to keep track of what you've got exposed.
But somebody will charge you a lot of money to do it for you. That's
that's right.
Again, it's all in the value, not the cost. It's all in the value it provides.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a tough nut to crack. I don't want to, be too critical, because it's a really difficult problem. But there's a way around this.
So what do you think then? I mean, I appreciate you referencing NIST there, because they gave us the CSF and so forth, and it is a good tool, place to start. And I would argue that the tiers, right, that they've implemented into it as well, the maturity tiers are helpful in a similar fashion as the NIST, as the CIS implementation groups. Yet with the changes that have happened recently, where there's been a series of layoffs at NIST, and there's been also several high-profile, resignations over current changes in the government's, we'll say, footing. What do you think is being lost now? Do you view NIST as still the capable, applicable, helpful organization that it has been at times in the past, or do you think it's what's it going to become as we're losing all these people?
Well, I mean, I haven't seen any indications thus far that they've like completely gone off the rails. I mean, I think they're still going to be there providing the best possible guidance. And you also have to remember too that a lot of the guidance that's provided out of NIST are basically out of these kind of formed committees that bring in a lot of outside opinions from the private sector, and they're just
especially whenever they do the CSF updates, everyone's got to get their notes in, and then you get CSF 2.0, which drives me up the wall without its consistent numbering.
Right. I think part of the problem is, and this has just been an ongoing issue, not just in cyber, but anything that requires any sort of framework for compliance, is that people, a lot of people, they see stuff like NIST, CSF, or frankly, any standard, and they see it as a checklist, right? Like, oh, I just got to, as long as I do these things, then I'm good to go. And then my insurance premiums are lower. And all of us know that have done like, kind of hands-on keyboard stuff, like that stuff doesn't work, because attackers don't go by a checklist. They don't say, oh, okay, well, they've implemented, dual factor, so I'm just going to give up. Like they're going to find ways around that, potentially. And so you got to start thinking much more like an attacker. I'm always a little, I like, that there are some standardized frameworks because it's helpful, but I think being a slave to that is very problematic. You always need to, keep in mind that there's like operational art to this, which is one of the reasons why I do both offense and defense. Because if you understand offense, and it makes defense easier.
Yes.
That's something that I think, unfortunately, a lot of people, like, they just haven't had that experience, so they don't see that sometimes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember, I think it was my first year at DEF CON. I was in, the kickoff, night before, or maybe it was Black Hat, the night before dinner that they have, and someone got up there and talked, and they're like, "Well, yeah, it's great to be here, but I'm more of a blue team person. I'm not a red team person." And I was like,
and that's when Dustin booed audibly.
Yeah, that's when I left. No.
Yeah, I got time for this.
but I was really surprised to see that. And you know what? I see that even now in cybersecurity in the field, I still see people who identify either as offensive or defensive cybersecurity, and it's like, but you're both, or you should be both. And if you work in a SOC, you probably have a pretty good idea of how offensive security works. And if you work as a pen tester, you probably have a pretty good idea of how a SOC works if you didn't start there. Which most folks I know who are pen testers started in the SOC, or have some SOC experience, and you have to, because you have to circumvent that stuff if you want to have anything good happen, but on your report, anything good to report. But yeah, that's always been a surprising thing to me. And you hitting on being a slave to a framework or standard goes. I won't get into it here, but it goes straight along with the research that I'm doing as well, and it's fascinating. How much, I guess you could say, like, psychology kind of goes into this, even at the leadership level, of using a framework or standard, and what what psychological constructs actually go into predicting use of those things. I'll talk to you about it offline.
Yeah,
if you ever want to talk about it, I can talk about it for hours. But
it's one of my favorite things to discuss, because people will say, oh, well, we've got it covered, we've implemented NIST CSF, and I'm like, well, that's great, but delve into it, right? Like,
tell me how you've implemented it,
right? Like,
these controls can mean so much.
I mean, one of my favorite areas, and you guys both know this, is I do a lot of work in risk calculation, right? And so if you like go into NIST CSF, you make your way down like the rabbit hole, and you get down to, okay, you got to do a risk assessment, and then you look at the standards that identify, like, well, this is how you actually calculate risk, and it's like threat, likelihood, and effect. You're like, all right, thanks, Sherlock. Like, I couldn't have figured that one out. And then you ask, you're like, then, I love to do this with my students. I'm like, how do you measure effect? And and then suddenly it's silence, right? Mm-hmm. And I've done this before with clients, because I do consulting as well, where I'm like, how did you measure a consequence? And they're like, well, we do low, medium, high. I'm like, okay, is that dollars? Is that mission effect? Is it like compute? Because there's different ways of measuring effect. And so the part of the problem is that you could have a risk assessment that has, we all know them, green, yellow, red, right? Like, low, medium, high, and it doesn't tell you squat. And yet you've implemented a risk assessment. And this is what I argue all the time, is that if I'm an offensive minded guy, my goal is, say, if I'm a criminal, is to apply as much leverage against you as possible to make you cry uncle to give me, my $5 million or $10 million in Bitcoin. So that means I need to understand your processes. Once I understand your processes, then I'm able to map your technology to it. And then I'm going to crush it. And it could be a single device. It could be a router, right? That you actually didn't include on your crown jewel list, right? And yet no packets are flowing.
There it is. Yeah.
Right. No packets are flowing, and that could create a major problem for you, right? Or, I can hit the DC and flood your network with ransomware and shut everything down. But there are key components that are part of your ability to manufacture tires or whatever it is. Yeah.
I love this, Charles. And sorry, every now and then I start calling Charlie Charles when I get really, really excited when I'm talking to him. But the reason I like this is I remember when it was one of our first meetings at when we first met each other at work, and there was so much focus on how important endpoints were for the discussion that we were having, and how, if there was going to be an exploitation, oh man, you really need to get those boxes and so forth. And it was you who pointed out the fact, well, you could spend all that time working on all that, or I bet these are all connected to a similar router. Do we really care about, what games might be installed on some end user box? Or would an attacker hypothetically be more interested in all the data that's, going in and out?
Mm-hmm. Right.
It shows those choke points very, very, very vividly.
Well, my favorite, maybe additional example to that is, I work with a lot of computer scientists, and so they love to talk about crypto. And they'll talk about this link is encrypted. Like, it would take you 20 million years to break it. And I'm like, you're right. And that's why I'm not going to try to break the crypto. I'm just going to hit the endpoints after you've decrypted, and I'm just going to steal it off your hard drive, right? Like, and they're looking at me, they're like, well, that's like not fair. You're like,
yeah,
yeah,
no, we don't like that.
Yeah, and I'm like, I don't play by your rules, right? I like to cheat and steal, and that's kind of what I do.
Right.
But yeah, so it's
like the hackers who always want to get the, they're like, oh, if you can get the webcam, you really have gotten it. It's like, not really, but if you can get the microphone and hear what everyone's saying in the room, that's really, impactful.
That's right. That's right. So that's why I always tell my students, I'm like, when you think about cybersecurity, it's important that you understand you have to think in systems.
Yes.
Not just layer 3 network maps, but systems. So like system dynamics, understanding how things flow, processes, and then how the technology enables it. Because at the end of the day, technology is just a tool for humans, right? We leverage technology to do certain things. And so if you understand how a port works, like a physical port, like a shipping port, then you can say, well, yeah, I could hit the ship itself, or I could just shut down the gantry cranes, or better yet, why don't I just take down the port management or the container management system for the shipping line? And when I do that, all those boxes that they've got to scan, right, like the big containers, like you don't know where they are in the yard. So it doesn't matter. I mean, the ship works, the gantry crane works, the trucks work, but no one knows like where the cargo is, and they don't know which cargo goes on what ship. So guess what? Port is down, all by hitting one database. So, this is the way you need to start thinking.
I agree. And as we're thinking about these vulnerabilities, and I like the idea of maximum, not minimal, but like smart effort. It's the working smarter, not harder aspect. Right. I think is kind of what you encapsulated there. Talking about working smarter and making people smarter, there is now you and I have discussed more than once the efforts to get to quantum faster, right? To get to quantum computing and to be the leader in AI. As you see, I'm talking on a national level here, so broad strokes. As you see, we just recently had legislation. I think the legislation came out with they were going to unhinder AI development for a long time, or make it so that there were laws that couldn't hinder. It would be illegal to pass certain laws to slow down AI development. Now that was stripped out of the legislation, but it's something that's on the mind a lot. When you take into consideration the national level competition we have with other nation states like China and so forth, when it comes to AI, when it comes to quantum, where do you think we currently sit, and what does the future look like to you?
So I spend an awful lot of my day thinking about what the world is going to look like in 20 years, because it's moving very, very quick. And then how that relates to security, because here at the university, I'm actually an international security scholar. I just tend to focus on cyber, but I do, I've got a lot of different skill sets and backgrounds, and they all kind of converge. So AI and quantum is an area that I focus an awful lot, or I'm starting to spend a lot more time thinking about, and how it relates to this stuff. So there are kind of a couple of key areas that you focused on. So let me first talk about how I see AI and quantum computing fitting into the more practical cyber problems. And then let me kind of switch gears towards the competition question that you asked. So with regard to the first, the way that you have to think about AI, because I get a lot of people saying, well, how does AI and cyber kind of work together? And they don't have a real good concept of how that works. Well, again, thinking in systems, you have traditional networks, we have cloud-based systems, and so you have like virtualized systems. And so you're going to have AI models, foundational models, ChatGPT, Grok, whatever, that's out there. And those are going to be hosted by, unless you're hosting your own, most likely hosted by a third party. So now you've added third-party infrastructure that, so you've expanded your attack surface, right? Mm-hmm. Your integrated attack surface across multiple vendors. Now it also includes like AI systems that you're potentially communicating with. And as you develop more agents, you're going to even the complexity of those interdependencies is going to grow. So think about it from a cyber perspective. You're like, oh crap. Like now it's not just about my on-prem And we just got done worrying about cloud and kind of getting some of our VMs secured and how we're going to manage, security in AWS or Azure or, Google Cloud. Now I also have to think about, okay, my connections back to OpenAI, my connections back to, Meta or whomever. And then, oh, by the way, I'm going to build a bunch of apps leveraging those core LLMs, that are going to connect back to my Gmail, that are going to connect to my calendar, that are going to, think about it, it just exploded, right? Mm-hmm. And so now if you are a Waymo, and you're now pushing out robo-taxis or other types of industrial robots, now you're communicating between all of those things with the sensor network in physical space. The complexity of the system is gone exponential. And when you think about that, all of those are running software that potentially have vulnerabilities that have to be patched. I mean, heck, we can't even patch our traditional systems all that well.
Right.
So now you're talking about a real paradigm shift in security, both in scope, so its distribution globally, right? Because maybe your AI model is hosted in, I don't know, Tokyo. The same way that you had to worry about VMs before. So you're going to have to contend with that. So that is a huge problem just on the kind of more traditional cyber side. In terms of competition, there's levels of competition now. There's, of course, the competition on kind of the building the technical infrastructure. So the Nvidia versus Huawei competition, right? That, the Chinese are actively trying to promote alternatives to Nvidia. Now, Nvidia has got, I would argue, a generational lead on everybody in terms of their technology, which is why
I would too.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about GPUs. I mean, the CEO came out, what was it, a week or so ago, and basically said, we're not a GPU company. That was the past. We're an algorithm company. And when you take a look at their keynotes, I mean, everyone thinks of Blackwell as a chip. It's not a chip. I mean, it's a fully integrated, stack of hardware and software, right? And they're really, what they're building out is towards robotics, right? And when you look at the future for NVIDIA, they're moving in the robotics world. So the competition is not just GPUs. I would argue that that's 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Where the competition is now really going to accelerate is the full stack. And I think what that's going to lead to is, when competitors are looking at NVIDIA's really fat profits, they're going to be like, we need to get a part of that. So I think you're going to start to see a carve up of parts of that market. But, NVIDIA's got such a stranglehold on it right now. It's not going to be easy. I mean, I'm a big believer in competition. I think it will come. I just think NVIDIA's got a real head start on this.
Who do you think the strongest who is currently positioned best to actually be competition against NVIDIA from your perspective? Is it AMD?
AMD, no, I don't think so.
I didn't think so. Everyone keeps saying it's AMD, but I would think that if it was AMD by now, we would have seen something better.
Those are people that only think in terms of chips, I think. It's because I heard the same argument when NVIDIA first started garnering a little attention. So I was, very fortunate to buy NVIDIA stock in 2017. So
it was one of your recommendations I took, sir.
It was one of my yes. I'm expecting my BMW to be delivered now, Frank, at any moment. But no, I think people who only thought about it in terms of chips, they immediately go to other chip, other folks in the chip sector. But so I think the Chinese are generally going to be the largest competition. It as an entire country, against NVIDIA. There are several.
It's remarkable, by the way. China versus a company.
Yeah.
Like a nation versus one company. I don't know what the story, what the moral of that story is, but it's something.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at Huawei as probably I'm not sure. I don't have deep insight into Huawei's R&D, of course, but I would imagine that there's quite a bit of effort there. So above the kind of the hardware, then you've got the foundational LLM models like OpenAI and you got Metas and X's, of course, or I guess not X's, but Well, I guess it is an X model.
XAI.
XAI. Sorry, I was forgetting. He has X and everything
over there. By the way, just a banner week.
Yeah. And then of course you've got all the app layer on top of it, and listening to a lot of like the private equity people, they have like priced out, or they've really tried to size the market out. And while right now a lot of it is in kind of the infrastructure phase, it's kind of like the 1980s of the internet is kind of right where we are right now for AI. But where they're really seeing the really big value, more than 100x times kind of what the hardware is going to be, is the app side. And the trick there is people are not going to develop very rarely going to develop new foundational models. It's too expensive to do that. So you're going to have 5 maybe major competitors, but everything is going to be on the app side, and the app side is going to be wholly dependent on your expertise. So I totally believe that the way that you actually build like an AI company is take a particular sector really well and try to solve real problems in that sector, right? Instead of hey, I've got a really cool superficial UI to ChatGPT where you can talk to it. Like, okay, that's moderately interesting in 2022, not very interesting in 2025, not at all interesting in 2030. But if you have a specific agent that solves a problem in the health sector, like for instance, you go to the dentist or you go to the doctor, and they are using computer vision now to help do diagnosis on radiology or x-rays, like that's a real problem, right? Like you've actually solved a problem in a specific sector. So I think that's where the like most intense competition is going to be. And that I think the United States is still in pretty good position. I think in terms of LLMs and hardware, LLMs, the harshest competition will definitely be with the Chinese. You've already seen that with like some of the Chinese models that have come out. And the hardware side, you'll also see some.
Do you use DeepSeek just as you go by? Do you use DeepSeek at all? Yeah, me either.
No, okay. No, I've got enough of my data sitting in Beijing. I don't need any.
That's
more.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Well, Charlie, this has been fantastic. Thank you for taking the time to meet with Dustin and I. We really appreciate it, and we'd love to have you back. I could talk to you all day, man. Yeah, it's rare in the field of cybersecurity where you can sit down with other people and just have academic level discussions and nerd out. I'm sure that as a result will make this our highest listened to episode. But I really appreciate the intention, the thoughtfulness, because I agree, and I think so does Dustin, Absolutely. That there really has to be a lot of work done in that specific area between tactical and executive, and you're doing a lot of the hard work there, from everything from discussing how the communication aspects have to improve to how people will start paying more attention once you're able to tie value to assets and things like that and show those choke points. So thank you so much. We look forward to talking to you again, and thank you everyone for listening. Oh, we're still in the running for the podcast competition. It'll be in the show notes. You'll see everything there. Additionally, continue to like and subscribe. Anyway, until next time, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you later.
Thanks, guys.